Hello, good evening, and welcome back to another episode of Minds on Guard, where we are learning how to guard our minds against all of the subtle manipulative tactics that are being forced upon us throughout our daily lives here in the 21st century, whether it be through media, the news, TV, magazines, social media, our families, our places of work, all of the things that we encounter in our day-to-day life. Tonight, we're going to continue our discussion of Edward Bernays and his work on shifting the thinking and behavior of the people in America. This man was truly a force to be reckoned with, and his ideas are still very much present and being utilized to great effect today. My aim in delving into the work of Bernays is to present information from which we're able to fill in various historical data so that we may be able to recognize the things in our daily lives that are there simply to keep us asleep to our innate ability to think for ourselves. Last week, we looked at the beginnings of propaganda in the 20th century, or what Bernays would go on to call public relations. This area of influence has outcroppings into all of the 21st century media, from cable news to social media platforms, all the way down to the way we dress ourselves today. The thoughts that we have are pervaded by the techniques that were developed in the early part of the 20th century through Bernays' ideas on propaganda and the outcroppings that had. This video will go into a bit more of the depth to which Bernays was able to penetrate society and utilize his understanding of his uncle Sigmund Freud's work on human psychology in order to steer people into giving up control of their more rational minds. So let's dig in. We spoke briefly in the last video about the shift that happened in American society during the 1920s. Prior to that decade, the American economy operated on a needs-based model. This means that the decisions that people made regarding the things that they invested their hard-earned money in were primarily made based on the utility, reliability, durability, and practicality as it pertained to daily life. It was only the very rich who could sort of frivolously spend money on luxury items that they desired to have. For the rest of society, the prevailing wisdom was to attend to needs over desires. While this was serving our country well, World War I had given the American manufacturing sectors a huge boost in production capacity and capability in order to keep pace with what was needed during the years that we were involved in a global conflict. Once the fighting was over, however, the factories were still running at their wartime capacity, only now the production would shift to serve the private sector as opposed to the military. As such, the large corporate interests that were owning and operating these factories were concerned that as peacetime continued, the people would return to their former pragmatic and utilitarian ways of living, and the surplus production would be lost to waste due to just essentially disinterest in the products being made. Big business needed a way to change the thinking of people in America so that they could ensure that their investments in expanding their production could be guaranteed to turn a profit in the future. It was this need that Edward Bernays would fill, and he would do it so well that the country would be forever changed at a essentially core level. The Torches of Freedom stunt served as the litmus test for the eventual changes that were to take place in the coming years. The success of what Bernays did by exploiting the subconscious desires of women to be seen as equal to men, as well as the emotional impact of connecting the purely American idea of freedom to the act of women smoking, was clear. He opened a number of doors for some really big moves to be made. In this publicity stunt for the tobacco industry, Bernays created a new way in which Americans would think about the products that they bought and used. What he demonstrated for the first time was that inanimate objects could be made into powerful symbols which represented how a person wants to be seen by others in society. This was the beginning of the shift within the economic model that had been operating in America, and corporate interests around the country immediately took notice of what had happened. The exploitation of people's innermost desires was to be the new way in which companies would target consumers in order to get them to buy their products. The shared interests of big banks, big business, and the media elites quickly went to work, tasking Bernays with the job of shifting the product-consuming behavior of the masses. They wanted to train people to put their desires before their needs. Throughout the decade, advertising campaigns and public relations firms would make use of celebrities, movies, and magazines' various publications to sell the various products in ways that would convince people that if they bought the things that gave off the appearance of material prosperity and affluence, or even if it was just the feeling that that might exist through the use of these things, they could then adopt that status themselves, regardless of actual social standing. The psychology of individualism and the need to feel unique within the crowd was fertile soil in which the fruits of Bernays' labor would grow. It would provide a methodology by which centralizing powerful interests could exert influence and control over the population. At the same time that Bernays was applying his uncle's ideas in the realms of business and the advertising of products, Freud's ideas had made their way into the thinking of the men who were at the top levels of government. Much of this was actually thanks to Bernays himself and his efforts to help distribute his uncle's writing to more and more people. He was actually the one who brought over his uncle's work and writings to America and helped sort of popularize it amongst the culture here. Post-World War I, the world was in flux regarding how to maintain the peace that had come and just what role the various powerful nations were going to play in ensuring that that peace remained. We've spoken a bit about the Paris Peace Conference, of which Bernays was a participant. It was at this conference where President Woodrow Wilson would promote his 14 points plan, which sought to establish, quote, an organized common peace. In order to achieve this, many prominent politicians and thinkers began to apply Freud's theories to their plans for how to ensure the peace that they sought would come to pass. It was easy to convince many that the ideas of irrational and repressed aggression were lurking in every man. The brutality of the war had made that clear to many, and the frenzy to which the masses could potentially be stirred was something that many saw as a seriously dangerous potential that needed to be addressed immediately. It put the fundamental thinking regarding the ways in which democracy functioned into question, that being that people could ultimately be trusted to be guided by their more rational minds. This was exemplified in the words of a man named Walter Lippmann, who was a member of President Wilson's inquiry that was established to sort of help guide the foreign policy of the day and aid in the development of the 14 points. He wrote that the public must be put in its place so that each of us may live free of the trampling and the roar of a bewildered herd. Lippmann proposed the idea that if democracy was to be successful, there must be a specialized class who would be over and above all and govern over the more irrational and therefore untrustworthy bulk of the population. These elitist ideas fell right in line with his socialist beliefs, and the likes of people like John Dewey would share such opinions regarding the need for an expert class that would be set over the masses to ensure people behaved in the interest of the common good. Bernays was fascinated by Lippmann's ideas and decided that he would be perfectly suited to achieve what was being sought. The aim would be to use the psychological techniques that were applied in public relations in order to control the feelings of the public. So why are we so focused on the work of Edward Bernays and his ideas about targeting feelings and emotions in order to control behavior? There are many, many other people and prominent thinkers of the day that we could look at, and I will be devoting time to a few of them in the future. But the reason I'm focused squarely on Bernays for now is because I see that this time period is one that contained a paradigm shift in our country where a small group of, frankly, arrogant, power-hungry elitists rose up and struck a mortal blow to the heart of how a free and open democratic republic was meant to function. By seizing the mechanisms of psychological control over the masses, the men running these schemes had decided, based on their own self-aggrandized view of their own thinking, that people must be trained into a state of irrational rationality. They sought to exploit our innermost desires and fears so that we might be hypnotized by the things which brought about the feelings of happiness and contentment. They combined the techniques used in the advertising world and applied them to the system of government and worked to attach people's feelings of happiness to the operation of democracy itself. This would ensure that so long as people were able to gain the feeling that the government was working in the best interests of the people, it really didn't matter what actually went on at the top levels. They could behave as corruptly and criminally as they liked, and if they could present the facade that they were working for the people, it wouldn't matter. That feeling would satiate any feelings that things weren't quite right, and people wouldn't ask questions or push back. The crowd would be controlled, and the powers that be could continue to seek ways to ensure that their power would be maintained and expanded into new areas of life. Over the coming years, the grip of power over the free thinking and decision-making of the population of this country would be slowly and methodically tightened. What we see today is the effects of this kind of emotional manipulation and exploitation across 100 years of implementation. Social media is where politics is carried out and where the emotional state of the masses is on full display. It is the area in which all manner of psychological manipulation is executed at the most extreme degrees, and Bernays' legacy is thriving through the digital environment in which the 21st century life is lived. By understanding that these techniques and the apps and the public displays of emotionally charged political pandering, that they have a singular aim, and that is being thought control and behavior control, it's my hope that we can all begin to wake up and get wise to what's being done to us. We are being herded, bewildered into a prison of our own design, and if we're not careful, we'll have followed the wills of evil right into our own comfy, cozy, and convenient graves. We will continue with more on Bernays and the psychology of control. Until then, check in on your loved ones, stay diligent, and stay vigilant, always keeping your minds on guard.